A very warm welcome to all the attendees. Thank you for joining us for this webinar on how to move to a continuous conversation-based performance management process. I'm Manali Vyas, your host today for this webinar. This session will be for 45 minutes. This webinar is conducted by Synergita. Synergita is a cloud-based performance management and analytics software which helps you focus on employee performance, employee engagement, and employee development. I would like to introduce you to the speaker for this session. The presenter for today's session is Ms. Jamie Resker. She is the founder and practice leader of Employee Performance Solutions. She is a recognized thought leader and innovator in the area of performance management. She helps organizations create a culture of performance-focused conversations by reshaping dialogue between managers and employees with a framework designed to exchange meaningful information. Jamie is the originator of the performance continuum feedback method, an approach for differentiating employee performance, identifying gaps, and crafting hearable, sayable feedback. She is on the faculty for the Northeast Human Resources Association and facilitates programs for HR professionals. Before handing over the control to Jamie, here are a few housekeeping instructions. All phones are set to mute. If you have any questions, please type them in the chat window located beside the presentation panel. We have received several questions from the registrants which will be answered by the speaker during the Q&A session. Also, we will continue to collect more questions during the session. If we are not able to address your queries during the session, you will certainly receive answers via email shortly. Thank you for your participation and enjoy the session. Over to you, Jamie.
Thank you, and I just wanted to thank Synergita for giving me another opportunity to run the webinar and share some information on how performance management is changing. And my goal is to, and I'm sure everybody who's here on a nice summer day, I feel like most HR people are in one of three places. You're either ready to make a move and you're ready to change how your organization is approaching performance management, and we know the focus has been on having more conversations, less emphasis on the forms and the process, or you're somebody who's thinking about it and maybe has to do a little more research and a little more homework to socialize the idea and get things off the ground. Or there's kind of the third category that I find is someone who's kind of skeptical about, would this really work to go away from annual performance reviews? I doubt it. How would you handle pay? How would you make sure managers are having conversations, etc.? So whatever phase you are in how you're thinking about performance management in your organization, my goal is to give you some tactics and some practical things that you're able to take away and modify for how you're doing performance management or how you're thinking about performance management in your organization. So the first thing I want to talk about are the practical considerations. There are things that we have to, if we say we're going to go away from doing annual performance reviews and ratings, there are some things that we're going to have to answer before we propose this idea in the organization. So I think in terms of, if we remove ratings, then how will we establish pay? How will we measure employee performance? How will we make employment decisions? And so I'm going to share with you a way to remove ratings but still be able to measure performance, make pay decisions, and make employment decisions. The other thing is thinking about moving away from annual performance reviews. Then how will we know that managers are actually talking to people about performance? How will we create any kind of documentation? And the good news is you don't have to move away from an annual process. You can keep an annual process, but I'm going to show you how to modernize it and make it feel like it's much more up-to-date and more collaborative. And I actually have an interesting example that I used using Synergita's technology to build a form that I always recommend people use. So you'll still be able to document performance, you'll still be able to have an annual performance conversation once a year, but the other piece is really how do you build in opportunities for managers and employees to have more of these informal conversations to drive and align performance. So the goal is to show you, at least during this webinar, the learning objectives are to show you how to continue making, measuring performance and making pay decisions, and how to reshape and manager and employee communications so that there's more frequent forward-looking dialogue versus the emphasis with the performance review is really about reviewing the past 12 months or 52 weeks of performance. And then the other piece is how to phase out performance reviews, but keep some sort of an annual process, and even how to automate the annual process. So I want to start with, first of all, measuring performance. So getting rid of annual performance and reviews and ratings doesn't mean walking away from measuring and assessing and differentiating employee performance. That's something that still should stay. And I think if you go back in your organization and propose the idea of removing ratings or performance reviews, one of the first questions is, well, how are we going to measure performance? How are we going to document somebody's performance? How are we going to pay for performance? So let's answer those questions up front. And so I have a model, and you may have seen this. I have a website, employeeperformancesolutions.com. I have a model that is a visual model that helps me think about performance with using two dimensions. One is, what is the person getting done? And I know everybody's probably heard of the what and the how. When I think about the what, I think about work results. So what are the person's job responsibilities? Are they meeting their goals? Do they have the right skills? So on the vertical, you'll see the work results. And anybody who's above the mid-level line, you would say that their work results are on target. The work is getting done. Anybody who's below the mid-level line, it's one of two situations. Either the person's new to the job, and that's why you see the word grow here. So they're new to the job, and with more time and training, you see the individual tracking up. Or the person's work results are off target, meaning they're not new to the role. They've been in the job long enough. They've had training and support, and despite either they're making an effort or maybe they're not making an effort, but they're not in that grow mode. We would say that their work results are off target. And then the other dimension of performance are what I call observable behaviors. Sometimes we say, I used to say behaviors, but I added the word observable because when I think about behaviors, I want to think about what do I see the person doing, how are they acting. These are behaviors that I can observe. The way your competency model or values would fit into this is you would say that the competencies would be descriptors of how you want people to conduct themselves. They're not actual behaviors, but they're descriptions of guidelines for people so that you can say these are the things that we expect from people as they walk through the door. So observable behaviors, right of center, we have on-target behaviors, and these would be expected behaviors, value-adding behaviors, and then left of center we would say somebody's behavior is off target, or somebody's doing something, they're behaving in a way that's detracting from their overall value, and they're doing something that's maybe unexpected, but they're behaving in a way that is either disruptive, and maybe they're not being disruptive, but they're doing something that's slowing the work down. So again, their value is less than somebody whose behaviors are right of center. So if I'm doing performance management, I want to make sure any activity that I'm doing in my organization, and we know that there are many, there are 360s, there are annual reviews, mid-year reviews, 90-day reviews, self-reviews, online tools, now there are apps, there are many different activities that we could be doing, but I always want to think in terms of the activities that I'm doing, and by the way, those activities are taking up people's time, managers and employees' time, and of course HR for tracking and implementing. I want to make sure that all the activities around performance management are driving people to the top right-hand corner. So if we were to look at the different quadrants on the continuum, we would say anybody in the top right-hand corner, on target work results and behaviors, that these are high accountable employees. Anybody who's in the lower right, we would say, and see I have the term growing here, this is the person who's new to the role, and with more time and training, we see them trending upwards. It's like they're on a long runway, but they're heading in the right direction. Here's the other type of performer in the lower right, which would be somebody who is on target in terms of their work results, but they're on target in terms of their behaviors, but off target in terms of the work results. And despite making an earnest effort, this person is trying to get the work done. They've been in the job long enough, they've been trained, supported, but see, they're hitting a wall here, and probably, I'd say with this person here, about 25% of the work results, the job is getting done. So 2 different scenarios in the lower right, and you can have, instead of just placing somebody in one spot on the continuum, I had an individual who said to her manager, can I put myself in 2 different places on the continuum? This is somebody who'd just been promoted from a recruiter to now she's a recruitment manager managing 2 people. So this individual said, as a recruiter, I'm in the top right-hand corner because I've been doing this work for a long time, but I'm in the lower right as a manager because I've never managed anyone before. So we don't have to just place somebody in one spot on the continuum. We can put them in multiple places depending on different aspects of their job. So the conversations and the support she's getting from her manager are all around developing her supervisory skills. So moving on, in the top left, you see the individuals are above the mid-level line in terms of the work results, but left of center in terms of a behavior. So there's some sort of behavior that's off target that's making, again, the person is less, their performance is less productive, there's some sort of value detracting aspect of their performance. And this is a little bit of a diagnostic. If I see somebody in the lower right, this means that the manager should be working with this individual on building their skills. If I see somebody in the top left, this means that there's some sort of behavior that needs to be adjusted. Now, if you think for a moment, what's easier for managers to talk about, work results or behaviors? Managers always say that they'd rather talk about work results, so somebody's responsibilities, their skills, meeting a goal, versus talking about some sort of a behavior. So my guess is that somebody who's left of center, there's not been a conversation about how this person can adjust some aspect of their behavior. And then the last part of the continuum is in the lower left. So if we place somebody in the lower left, this means that their work results are off target and their behavior is also off target. So we have a combination of these 2 factors at play. And so when I think about performance, I want to think about just not one dimension. Usually there's 5 levels of ratings, exceeds expectations, outstanding, meets expectations, below expectations, and unsatisfactory. I'd rather look at this visual model that's more holistic because it's very hard to fit people into this single category. So this is the way of measuring performance. Here's some data from other organizations, and I just brought up 6 of these images of flip charts. And you can see with these dots that there is an activity that we did in the organization, and you can do this in your organization. You can have your managers come together and plot where they see people on their team. And my advice to you is to introduce the performance continuum. It's not an online tool. It's not designed to be an online tool. It's a tool that you show managers how to use so that they're able to think multidimensionally about somebody's performance. And I always advise that a manager check with their direct manager and also their peers and have a conversation and say, here's where I see my 5 people. Where do you see people on my team? So this is something that's done with some input. But if you look at these continuums here, you see in the top right-hand corner, 57%. Here's another one with 41%, 46%, 50%, 48%, and 60%. And here's the trend. I've done this many times, and it's usually you'll find anywhere from 40 to 60% of people in the top right-hand corner. In the top left, and again, this is somebody whose work results are on target, but their behavior is off target. 17%, 29%, 16%. Here's 17%, 25%, and another one that's 17%. And usually in the lower left, it's usually around 8%, give or take. And so you'll see here is 13%, 12%. So these are people that they're taking up a position in the organization, but as you can see, the work is not the position that person is in. The job responsibilities are not being accomplished, and there's some sort of behavior that's detracting from their value and more than likely slowing people down. 14%, 6%. And then the balance of people would be in the lower right, and sometimes I say indicate if it's a new person who's tracking up or whether it's somebody who's stuck and not making progress. But if you think about, more strategically think about performance management and, what should performance management accomplish? Is 57%, 41% of employees in the top right-hand corner, is that what the goal is? Most executive teams that I'll consult with, they will always say, I'll say, how many people do you want in the top right-hand corner of your continuum? And consistently they say between 75 and 80%. Sometimes people say 100%, but I always think that we're going to have new people joining the organization, so we're always going to have people tracking up. But I think that's a goal. So again, if we're doing things around performance management, we should actively be driving and measuring whether people are heading to the top right-hand corner. So how would you bring this back to your organization? I would say the first thing to do would be to train managers to use the employee performance continuum, get them to use it. You can draw it on a napkin if you want, and I have a tool that you can download, and I'll show you where to get that on my website. And train managers to articulate why and where they placed somebody on the continuum, and also make sure that they're soliciting peer and direct supervisor input so that they have a balanced view. And I would recommend doing the continuum. Usually called a performance continuum snapshot, doing this twice a year. And it's also a way to determine whether whatever you're doing around performance management is working, because you'll see the number in the top right-hand corner growing. You'll see fewer people in the other parts of the continuum. So as we mentioned at the beginning, you can type in any questions you have into the chat, and we're going to take those at the end. So this presentation, me talking, is going to be about 35 minutes, and then we'll have 10 minutes for Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions, just type them in, because I'm going to go on to the next part, which is about making pay decisions without ratings. And you probably guessed by now we're going to use the continuum to help us do that. So before I go on and talk about how to make pay decisions without ratings, and kind of show you the approach for that, we have a poll question that we want to ask, and Synergita is going to launch the poll. And if you could just answer the question, does your organization currently use performance review ratings to make your pay decisions? We have a yes or a no. You may also have some other factors that you use to make pay decisions, but does your performance review and the rating system or the scale that you use influence how you make pay decisions? And we'll just take about 10 or 15 seconds to let you participate in the poll. I'm unable to see the poll results yet. And I know Synergita is tabulating this, so anybody on the Synergita side is welcome to come in and share the poll results.
Yeah, hi Jamie, Emmanuel here from Synergita. We have received the responses for the poll question. About 60% of the people say yes, and about 40% of the people say no. Okay, so 60% of you use the annual performance review and ratings to make pay decisions, 40% do not. Usually if you're using the performance reviews and ratings to make pay decisions, oftentimes what you'll see is that if somebody gets the highest rating, there's a range for a pay increase that they could receive. And so it oftentimes feels like there's a formula that, okay, if somebody meets expectations, they could get between a 2 and a 3% pay increase. So 40% of you don't use annual performance reviews and that type of a skill to make your pay decisions. So I'm sure you're taking into consideration performance and some other factors. So you're not, 40% of you are not held to, many organizations don't want to go away from annual performance reviews and ratings because they can't figure out the pay piece. So 40% of you are already in a good spot for not having that impede walking away from annual performance reviews. The 60% of you, and I'm sure that even the 40% of you have worked in organizations where your pay increases or merit pay increases were tied to annual performance review ratings. So we've seen this before. So let's just talk about how to use the continuum to help inform. I'm going to use the word inform your pay decisions, not to completely make the pay decisions, but help to influence your pay decisions. So if you think in terms of, first of all, what is your merit budget? So usually the formula for merit budget is 3% of total payroll. And so if you want to define your pay for performance philosophy, start with saying, well, where do you want to spend the money? And so you'll see on the screen here, these are just some examples. This one organization, they're deciding to spend 1.75% of their merit budget on people in the top right-hand corner, 0.5% in the lower right, and 0.75 in the upper left. So these are just some ways that you can look at, take a step back from kind of the process that you have in the organization and make a decision as to where do you want to spend the dollar. So that's one tool that you can use. And then the other tool that you'll see here is just 2 dimensions of making pay decisions. So we have the performance dimension, and you see that that's the continuum, and then we also have the salary range dimension. So where is the person in their salary range? Most organizations will have a salary range scheme that's based on market pay data, and sometimes you'll have your own internal salary range or pay grade system, but oftentimes that's also based on market data. So this is just an example. You can take this model and plug in different numbers, but if you have somebody who's your very top right-hand corner person, you'll see here that the guidance is between 7 and 8% pay increase, but you're also going to take into consideration where is this person in the salary range. If there's somebody who's at the max or maybe even above the max, that pay increase percentage is probably going to be lower, but you may want to reward them with some sort of a bonus or a one-time payout that's not going to be folded into their base pay. And if you look at these numbers here, sometimes people really feel like they have to have some sort of numerical system or level system to make sense of pay increases. And so you'll see here along the side, I'm going to start with the work results. You'll see the very top level rating would be, and I know we don't usually assign numbers to people, we don't say you're a 5, but there's usually 5 different levels, and we can be creative with that. We can say the top person is outstanding, the next level down is exceeding, middle is solid performer or meets expectations, etc. So that's why you see these numbers. So the 5 means the top level performer. So if we look at the person who's in the very top right hand corner, they're at the top level in terms of their work results, and they're also the top level in terms of their behaviors. So they're a 5, 5. And you look at the person on the opposite side, this is the person who's also top in terms of their work results, but in terms of their behaviors, they're at the lowest range, so they're a 5, 1. We don't want it, I know sometimes we'd like to have one number, but we really can't fit people usually into one category. So if we said this person who's in the very top left-hand corner, who's a 5 in terms of their work results and a 1 in terms of their behavior, we could average this and get a 3, but that would mean that the person's meeting expectations, and they're not meeting expectations, they're actually exceeding their expectations in terms of their work results, but they're below, they're off target in terms of their behavior. So I try to encourage people not to use a single rating system because that usually only works on the diagonal, but you want to use a dual rating system. What's better than using a dual rating system is just to use the continuum to plot. So if you have somebody who's, who's your mid-level performer right here, this person's, you see their work results are on target. They're not, lighting things on fire, but they're solid performer. This person would be this 3-3. You might say, gee, this person's at the minimum. I'm going to give them, I want to bring them up to the mid. And so you're considering two different factors, making a pay adjustment based on their market range or their salary range, and also taking into consideration performance. The other factor to think about is, instead of giving people a percent and saying, thanks, Joe, you did a great job this year, here's your $2,250. Would you rather say that? Would you rather say, here's the dollar amount you're going to see in your, your next paycheck, here's going to be your new salary increase, or would you rather say, Joe, you've done a great job, here's your 1.35% pay increase? So instead of going, continuing with percent increases as the way you communicate that to employees, I always advise, go to a dollar amount, reflect your pay increases as just base salary increases, put together a letter, you will see X, dollar pay increase in your paycheck. If you're really moving away from ratings, that's one way to help people make that jump. Because if you say we're not doing ratings and then you give somebody a 2.5% increase, they automatically affiliate that with some sort of rating. So some guidelines on paying for performance, not using ratings. And so just, as you're making, if you're moving from discussing ratings and moving away from ratings, so instead of discussing ratings with the person, you're really able to discuss their performance. And you want to have one time a year that you say, this is salary administration. So on your calendar of your activities, instead of saying it's annual performance review time, you want to split that up. You want to split up an annual event from your salary pay event. And so on your calendar, I like to call it salary administration. When it's an annual performance review and salary is part of the conversation, the person is not thinking about the conversation they're having with their manager about their performance. They're really focused more on what's their change in pay going to be. So call it what it is. Say salary administration happens in May, and take the opportunity of the rest of the year to be talking to people about their performance and help people stay focused on that conversation as opposed to mixing up the compensation piece. So if you're moving away from ratings, I would say that you're moving towards those performance snapshots, and ratings determining pay. Instead of ratings determining pay, you're still going to pay for people's performance, and also reflecting merit not as a percentage but as a dollar amount. And the performance snapshots, going back to the recommendation of doing this twice a year, you want to do this one time a year where it has nothing to do with pay at all, and then you do it another time of year. Maybe you do this twice or 3 times a year, but one of those performance snapshot, when you capture that information or help managers capture the information, then you can link that to the pay. So again, somebody's performance doesn't completely alone determine the pay decision. It's also going to be how much money is in the budget, how much money is available to spend, and also where are they in the salary range. So the next piece that we're going to cover, and I always feel like I have to talk about the performance continuum first before we talk about how do we reshape manager and employee communications, because we don't want to just say we want more communication between employees and managers. We want to be very specific that there's already communication happening. People are talking about projects and tasks. They're having one-on-one meetings. They're having these everyday work conversations. So we don't want to mix those types of conversations up with performance-driven and focused conversations. So when I think about performance conversations, we want the manager to think about, where do I see this individual, this employee on the performance continuum, and how should this influence my conversations with the individual throughout the year. So we're going to do another poll. We have 3 polls total. If you could just answer the question here, which is outside of your annual formal performance review, maybe you call it a appraisal, evaluation, but most organizations have an annual formal process that happens. Does your organization have a process with guidance from managers and employees to engage in conversations about performance? So many organizations, and it's a yes or no question, many organizations will, and I did this when I was in HR, I would tell managers to have conversations all the time, give feedback often and early, no surprises. Those were reminders, I guess, and aspirations, but I wouldn't have called that a formal process. Our formal process was that we had an annual performance review. We also had a mid-year performance review. But again, that's not a conversation. That's more of a formal process. So does your organization right now have something in place that gives specific guidance to managers and employees for engaging in conversations about performance? And Emmanuel,
Jamie,
go ahead. Yes.
Yeah, we got the results of this particular poll. About 54% of the people say no, and 46% of the people say yes.
Okay. So that's encouraging. Sometimes we say the formal conversation, is the annual performance review, and we might have something that we have where managers have regular one-on-ones, but it's encouraging to see that more organizations are going to something that's more structured. So when I go back to the continuum and I think about how do I use this to help inform conversations, I want to think about anybody who's in the top right-hand corner. We're coaching these individuals for growth. So somebody in the top right-hand corner, they're already high accountable. They're already good at what they're doing. How does this person become even more effective? Is there something that they're interested in working on? What skill do they want to build? What do they want to be involved in? So conversations here are really about the person's growth. Somebody who's in the lower right-hand corner, this will tell me that my conversations and support should be focused on coaching this person for skills. Somebody who's in the top left-hand corner, there's some sort of behavior that they need to be coached on. And then in the lower left, it's usually, I would say for each person in their performance in their job, there's usually one thing to stop doing, start doing, do more of, or do less of. And the continuum can help the manager figure that out. But what's important is, there's 2 things about the continuum: the current position, the current snapshot, and the planned position. So where is this person now, and why, and what would I need them to do to make progress? And so usually for everyone, there's one thing to adjust, and somebody in the lower left, though, they're usually 2 different themes, 2 different things that are not even related to each other, but of course are performance-based. So I know I started with the continuum and with ratings and measuring performance, but to me the more important thing is that, snapshot in time, where do I see this person, where do I need them to be, and did I ever articulate that as the manager? Did I ever articulate that to the person? And one thing that I found a number of years ago that I thought was interesting is that Mercer had done a survey, and one piece of data was that just 6% of managers were skilled at having candid dialogue with their direct reports about their performance. And another piece of data was that with formal performance reviews, just 14% of managers were skilled. So I always ask people when I'm running a workshop, I'll say, what are the chances that your manager is in the 6%? Well, it's 6%. So, and I was also a manager. I managed 10 people in my last job. And even though I knew that I should be giving feedback all the time and, just-in-time feedback, I still wasn't doing it, especially if the issue related to a behavior. So if we look at this continuum here, you can see that, everybody outside of this top right-hand corner, their performance is off target in some way. And, what's interesting is that, when I've asked people, so I'll run these programs for employees on how do you assess your own performance, how do you ask for feedback, how do you ask the right questions of your manager, of your peers, etc. People who are truly seen by other people as operating in the top right-hand corner, they'll usually plot themselves outside of the top right-hand corner. And I think it's
because they're more aware. They're maybe harder on themselves, or I should learn this, or I don't know how to do this, and why did I say that in that meeting? And people who are operating outside of the top right-hand corner, you can guess that they put themselves in the top right-hand corner. So I would say I don't believe anybody shows up to work saying, I'm going to be incompetent, watch me do it. I believe everybody wants to make a contribution, but when somebody's performance is off target, I want to first of all say, why is the person's performance off target? Is it because they're unaware? And when I look at, the percent of managers that are skilled at having candid conversations about performance, my guess is that most people, their performance is off because they haven't been given clear feedback. Now, it could also be that the person doesn't know how to do something, they can't, or they won't, and that's where, somebody doesn't know how to do something, that's coaching, that's training, that's mentoring, but somebody might not be able to do something, they can't, so that would be somebody who's in the lower right. Despite making that earnest effort, they're not able to make progress. And so to me, that would mean, I probably have to move that person out of the role and move somebody else into the role, and maybe there's something else in the organization for that person to do. It could also be that the person won't. That means, I'm probably going to help the person out of the organization, open up that position for somebody who can get the work done. But we never want somebody to be failing in their job or to be off in their performance because they're unaware. And managers oftentimes will give feedback that's too general, too generic, and it's not actionable. So if I said be more proactive or communicate more, that's too vague, and so oftentimes the manager thinks that they've given information, but it's not actionable. So going back to the way we typically do performance management is encourage managers to have conversation, give feedback all the time or as needed. But I think what we're seeing is we are moving away from a calendar event where we say, okay, on this date every year the manager is going to try to recall all 52 weeks of your performance and track that in this annual event. Maybe somebody could remember the last couple of weeks because that's fresh information, but what we want to be able to do is we want to supplement any kind of an annual process with smaller conversations. So maybe the right cadence for your organization is for managers to have 6 conversations specifically about performance a year, and maybe one of those conversations, I'm going to get to this in the next piece, is to do something that's a little bit more formal. So what could that process look like? So I have something I call the 10-minute questions conversation, and to me these questions help make the conversation focused on somebody's performance. So there's a worksheet, and this is low tech, this is not in an app, this is not something that's done with online feedback, this is an eyeball-to-eyeball conversation, or it could be done by phone or Skype or some sort of other meeting platform if somebody's working remotely. But here's 3 basic sets of questions. There are other questions you could substitute in here, but here's the first question that the manager would ask the employee. So the manager and the employee meet, and the employee knows ahead of time, the manager knows ahead of time, these are the questions that I'm going to be asking and answering, so they're prepared. So I know my manager is going to ask me these 2 questions. What's one thing you want to highlight from this month that you accomplished, or something that's gone well? And what's one thing you want to get better at? What's one thing you want to learn about? What's one thing you want to be involved in? And it's about one thing, and it's really about now. This is not 6 months ago. Let's review the past year worth of performance. So the worksheet is just for people to take notes, and I know my manager is going to ask me these questions in advance, so I can take notes in advance about what I want to say. And my manager is using the same worksheet, and he or she, they're taking notes about what I'm saying. And then I'm asking my manager, I'm the employee, I'm asking, so what's one thing I'm doing well that's working that I should continue? And what's one thing I could do to be even more effective in my role? Or what's the next thing for me to focus on? So let me pause. This is where the manager thinks about, where's this person on the continuum? What would help this person move forward, and how do I articulate that feedback? To me, that's what the manager training is for. So again, this worksheet is just for notes, and then the manager is asking, what's one thing, as your manager that I'm doing well that's working to support you that I should continue with, and what's one way I could work better with you, or what's one way I could support you more. And you could see you could substitute other questions in for these, but these are really good basic questions, and and sometimes I'll videotape two people in an organization doing the 10-minute conversation questions, and you'll see that it takes probably anywhere from 5 to 8 minutes, so it's usually not even 10 minutes. And then you'll see on the bottom, is there any plan for following up on things that we talked about from this meeting, and what's your progress from the last check-in that we had, and then we put the date on here. One question that people also often have, especially if you're in HR, is how do we know managers are having this conversation? Should we collect these notes? My advice is don't try to put this into some sort of electronic format, because the sense is that this should be informal. There's a structure to it. And I'll share with you why these questions, but it should be informal. You have to kind of let go and trust that the manager and the employee will have this conversation, have some sort of guidelines. You know, does the employee schedule this meeting? How often does it happen each year? Does the manager schedule the meeting? But don't try to collect people's notes on what they're talking about. This, again, it's a conversation, and I'll get to the part where you can do something that's formal, and you can collect it, and you can use it for documentation, but let this be something that's informal. Sometimes managers will say, when they first look at this and say, you want me to talk to people about their performance 6 times a year, they'll say there's no time, and I always bring up this number. There's 9,600 minutes in a month, so there is definitely time for managers to take 10 minutes and do this, 6 times a year, or however often your organization decides. And then why these questions? Why these questions? Why don't we just have people talk for 10 minutes? And so I always think that the questions are going to determine the answer that we get. So if I'm asking, so how's everything going? I'm going to hear something that's vague, like, oh, you're doing great. What can I do better? I can't think of anything. What did you think of my presentation? Oh, it was really good. What can I do differently? Nothing. Just keep doing what you're doing. So we don't want to leave it up to managers, and it worries me sometimes organizations will say, well, we're telling managers to meet with their employees at least 4 times a year. Well, they're probably talking about projects and tasks, which, again, that's important. That's about the everyday work. Let that still happen, but that's not a performance-focused conversation. And then asking these vague questions, it's kind of like, how's everything going? Everything's great or good. Asking these vague questions, it's like nothing goes in and nothing comes out. How was your weekend? Oh, it was great. How was your day at school? It was really good. So we don't want to. We want to have a system that really is quick and it leads to insightful information. And I don't know why it works, but asking these one-thing questions, what's one way I could work better with you? What's one way I could support the team more? It always leads to something that's substantial and meaningful and actionable. So what I would say is that if you're moving to a system where you're asking managers and employees to engage in conversations, don't just assume that managers and particularly employees have the skills to automatically do this. It's not about, here's a form, go off and have conversations. You can have some tools and supports for people, but I would advise that you provide some sort of conversation skill support training to people. So when you think about the do's and don'ts of moving to this continuous performance management framework, you want to have some sort of approach, like the 10-minute questions conversation. Don't just tell managers to have more conversations without some sort of guidelines. And this is not, performance conversations are not one-on-ones. Still do one-on-ones, maybe attach these conversations to the one-on-ones, but it's not doesn't substitute for one-on-ones. Make sure it's conversation-based. Don't rely on technology or apps. Wouldn't it be great if you could use an app to manage your kids and to give feedback to your significant other? I can see how that's an attractive idea, especially if you have a large population and you need to scale something, but don't rely on apps and technology to replace conversations. And establish a minimum frequency. Get your managers to agree that, okay, it makes sense for us to do this 6 times a year. Don't be vague about how often conversations take place and what the content should look like. And then provide some support and training to managers and employees. I have a program, I call it Optimize Conversations to Optimize Employee Performance. It's a 4-hour training session for managers. It can be, I license it, you can be trained to deliver it in your organization, but it's all the materials and all the training that a manager needs to walk away and especially to know how to answer that question when the employee asks, so what's one thing I could do to be more effective in my role? I like the idea of reframing any gaps to think and talk in terms of what the person should do going forward. So don't assume that managers and employees already know how to have these conversations. Provide some sort of support and keep the conversations informal. Don't force managers and employees to document these conversations. Which brings me to the last piece is do document and have an annual process. And maybe you say, you know, we're going to have 5 of these, you know, informal conversations, 10-minute conversations, whatever you're calling them, and once a year we're going to do something that gets documented that's a little bit more formal. I want to just talk quickly about, you probably have competencies in your organization, or sometimes we call them values or success factors. If those are important to you, keep those, but instead of the manager commenting on each and every one of them. So we've seen this before where we have a whole list of our competencies, you know, communication, teamwork, quality of work, innovation, etc. And we ask the manager to comment on each and every one of those and maybe even give a rating. That becomes redundant, and the manager is no longer thinking about the employee, but they're thinking about how do I get this form filled out, and it really becomes an activity where the boxes are being checked. And so I like to use this document. I call it the Performance Conversation and Planning Map. You can find this on my website and you can download. It's just a Word version, and I'm going to show you how Synergita put it into their tool. But here are the sections for it. So area for strengths. So what does the person do really well? What are some examples? What's the positive impact? And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to list the related competencies. So I'm not commenting on each and every competency. I'm thinking about the person first. What is a strength? What are some examples? And by the way, those examples are probably going to have come from the last couple of weeks because that's the recent effect. And then what's the positive impact? And then what's next? So instead of area for development, which is code for here are your weaknesses, I just like to use the terminology what's next. So think about where the person is on the continuum, what's going to help propel them forward, and what are the specific details. So what are the actions the person should be taking? So instead of being vague, specifically what should the person do and why is it important, and again, what are the related competencies? Anything that's around what's next can be pulled down as a goal. These are not regular work goals or project goals, but specifically for this conversation, anything that's what's next should be a goal. What are, again, the actions? This is where you put in the measurement and then the time frame. And see how it's called the Performance Conversation and Planning Map? Get rid of the words appraisal, review, evaluation, because that implies we're looking at the past 52 weeks. And this is really not about looking at past performance. So before I show you how to plug this information into an online tool, one more poll question. Do you right now use a software or a tool to manage your employee performance process? So are you currently using any sort of technology to run your annual performance review or mid-year reviews? And it's just yes or no, and I'll let Emmanuel come in and share the polling information. While, oh, go ahead, Emmanuel.
Yeah, around 63% of people say no, and 38% of people say yes. So 38% use software, and 63 don't. Okay.
Okay. Well, thank you for answering that question. It's pretty common nowadays to want to automate the process. The process I just showed you is the process that I think is useful. I don't think, you know, filling out forms, trying to recall 12 months of performance is that effective. But I think it's helpful to have something that's automated. And I have been looking for a number of years for an organization for an online performance management
software company who could take that form I just shared with you and put in the pull down of your competencies, and kind of come up short. And I had gotten in touch with Synergita about a year ago, and they were able to, and I'm going to show you a screenshot in a minute. They were able to say, no problem, we can do that within a day. I had kind of this framework that I like to use in this online tool. But Synergita, they're a company that's in the space where they've got continuous feedback, employee performance management engagement software. They have 60,000 paid users from over 80 companies. And what I really like about them is that they're flexible, and they guarantee that there's no downtime. They do all of the legwork for you. And I have worked with some of my clients on training for the performance conversations, where they have some big name software companies that I'm sure we've all heard of, that the implementation of the system literally takes weeks. And so I think if you do move to adopt something that's an online tool, you want something that's quick and isn't taxing your limited resources. So this Synergita system has all of these capabilities, where I do also like the idea of using a system to track goals. I think goals should be kept online, but revisited. I would have employees and managers revisit goals no less than every 2 months, because things change. I've heard this story over and over. HR people will say to me that right at performance review time, they'll have managers run down saying, "Can I have a copy of my performance review so I can see what the goals were for last year?" To me, those are fake goals. Those are not real living goals. So I like the idea of tracking goals online, and then revisiting them and altering them every couple of months as needed. So there's a continuous feedback system, there's a recognitions component to their tool, check-ins, and then annual reviews. And let me show you the annual form that I put in to actually Synergita created. So it's based on the form I just shared with you. So here's just a screenshot. So here's the area of strength, some examples, positive impact, and then they were able to put in the competencies with this pull down. So this is where your organization competencies could be. And again, I really like this approach because the manager is not having to comment on each and every one of them. So if you're interested in this tool, don't get in touch with me about it, but get in touch with Synergita, because they could share more information with you on this. So just a learning tool and tools recap. So measuring and making pay decisions, you can do that without ratings, and you can reshape manager and employee communication so the focus is not on the past, but what's working now and moving ahead. And I would say that you want to keep but modernize some sort of an annual process, and automating that is not difficult. I think just the idea of going away from some sort of an annual process altogether might seem a little extreme for many organizations, and let this serve as your documentation, the thing that goes into the file or that is in the system, but let those conversations be informal and leave those up to the manager and employee, of course with some support and check-in. So I'm going to conclude with saying that the most important thing is to keep the important thing, which is the activities that you're doing around performance management. Are they driving people to the top right-hand corner? So I would look under, look at everything with a microscope and ask yourself whether the activities you're asking your managers to do, your employees to do, and that you're doing in HR, are those activities driving people to the top right-hand corner? So at this point, I just want to mention, if you're going to be in the Boston area on October 24th, I'm running a full-day program on customizable tools and tactics for modernizing performance management workshop. This information I provided you with today is a bit of a snapshot, but that's coming up on October 24th, and you could find out more at nira.com under the events section. And if you are interested in
any of the tools, the Performance Continuum. I have some other tools on my website. Just go to employeeperformancesolutions.com under the Resources tab. You can find me on LinkedIn at Jamie Resker, and my email here. And then with Synergita, the contact there is info@synergita.com. I'm assuming that that Emmanuel, you'll send some sort of follow-up email so that people could respond directly to that if they have any questions or want to get in touch. And at this point, we're going to take your questions. So, Emmanuel, were there any questions that came in?
Hi, Jamie. Yeah, there are some questions. So the first one is, can conversations replace ratings? If we are doing both, then won't we be spending more time doing performance management?
Well, I would say that the conversations, again, if you use a framework like the 10-minute conversation, they literally are 10 minutes or less. That's if people stick to the questions and the script. So let's say that you do 6 of those meetings a year. That's a total of 1 hour. And I would have your managers work with their boss and even with HR doing, I call it discovery session, you might call it a calibration session, but do 2 of those snapshots a year. If you look at, and maybe that'll take another hour, but if you look at how often, each employee, at least in the US, a full-time work schedule is 2,080 hours a year. So we're asking managers to maybe spend 2 hours on each of their employees. If you look at it that way, that's not a big investment.
Okay. Here's another question, Jamie. Is there any automated way to implement the continuum model?
No, but I wish that there were, and I'll talk to Synergita about that. How does that sound?
Okay. Okay. Here's another one. What is the expected success rate of performance continuum model?
Well, the success rate is only based on whether your managers are having conversations that are driving people towards the top right-hand corner. So this is not I'm going to do this once a year and put it in the drawer for the next 12 months. So it's based on each manager's commitment and your commitment as an organization to support managers and having the conversations. But it's not, this is something that HR can introduce and roll out, but this is not an HR program. This really has to be each and every manager committing to having the conversations. And that's why I like to usually do a half-day workshop for the managers and show them the 10-minute conversation, show them the tool, show them how to reframe gaps into future-focused performance. And then what I say is, so how often do you think you should have these 10-minute conversations in your organization? And most people will say, we should do this every month. And I try to pull back and say, well, why don't you do this every other month? But if you start as HR telling people you're going to do this 6 times a year or you're going to do this 12 times a year, it won't be as successful. You really need to have the managers to commit and see it and socialize the idea and get them to say, this makes a lot of sense. We're gonna commit to doing this 6 times a year. So the performance continuum by itself, it's not a standalone tool. It's just, to me, it's the beginning of the process.
Thank you, Jamie. Here's another one. What is the pattern that companies most likely to see in a pay chart? Is it anything similar to a bell curve?
No, it's, again, I'm going to go back to the continuum. There's about 40 to 60% who are high accountable. In the top right-hand corner, there's another about 20% who get the work done, but their behavior is off. 8% plus in the, off-target, work results and behaviors, and then the other people are new. So I don't believe in trying to fit people into the bell curve. I mean, it could be similar to the bell curve, but I like to look at it in the 4 square.
Okay. What are some of the important components that should be discussed in 10-minute manager-employee conversation?
To me, the 10-minute manager, and I specifically use the 10-minute questions conversation. The most important thing for me is to drive the conversation using the questions. So it's really, you'll find as a manager and as the employee, if you're participating in the 10-minute conversation, you'll do less talking and more listening. So the question drives the conversation. So it really is, what is it that you want to know? Maybe the employee wants to know, you know, what's one way I could contribute more to the team? I would put your energy, your focus into designing the question, because that's going to determine the information. So it's what information do you want to get? So then what question are you going to ask for that?
Great. I think we'll wind up a session over here. We'll send rest of the questions through email. Thank you, Jamie, for sharing your experiences with us. And thank you all for attending the session. Hope you all had a good and informative session. If you have any other questions, please feel free to send the email at info@synergita.com. We will send the recorded version of this webinar to all of you. Once again, thank you all. Thank you, Jamie.
You're welcome. Thank you.